thank you all for jotting some things down. And these are questions we're hearing across the region. You know, it's not unique to Western North Carolina or high country. However, with the geography here, as we have found with the 3 or so inches of snow today, you're under a little bit of a kind of a faster time clock for making improvements and doing vegetative type repair before it simply gets too cold or the ground freezes. So it's part of the impetus for trying to do this as soon as possible. One of the first questions that I saw up on the board that I wanted to highlight is like, how do we help combat misinformation that makes farmers hesitant to apply for programs? And for all of you here today, you're not signed up necessarily to be an assistant helping anyone come to programs and apply for assistance, but perhaps with the information you learned today, you are a little bit of an ambassador. And as you have peer connections in the community, you might take something you heard today and encourage somebody else that, no, there is something that like might uniquely fit your situation, and this is what it is, or who to talk to. And particularly as we see like just even how many organizations are present in the room and how many of us have, you know, a bleeding heart, we want to help. How do we remain collaborative and coordinating our efforts together so that farmers get the best information and the soonest information? There's quite a few specific questions, and I think we're going to be able to address several of these today. And I invite you to also be okay with some being unanswered. And part of our team's role is to help find the answers, or maybe others in the room might help find the answers for you. To take us out for a minute and kind of zoom up 20,000 feet, when we think about disasters, have you ever encountered a disaster on your farm? Or do you know someone up here who's encountered a disaster on their farmland before? Before Helene, I mean. Not to that magnitude, okay.
We have farmers who, Helene was horrible flooding, but we have farmers over the last three years, maybe 5 years, who have lost their bulk of their farm stuff more than once to flooding.
Okay. So maybe it's increasing in frequency and intensity. The flood itself is nothing new. We've seen this before here, but the magnitude of it is more than we've ever seen. What else? What other kind of disaster has affected farms in this area before?
Yeah.
Hail, so crop damage, particularly affected by hail. What else?
Just the movement of silt.
Movement of silt, okay. In this case, it can be contaminated silt. What else? Freeze, yeah. Too warm. So has anyone noticed that I think 99 out of 100 counties in North Carolina right now are under a drought condition, despite what we all experienced as part of the state?
It didn't rain for a month after.
Yep. And we've had in 2024 alone, we've had really intense periods of a lot of rainfall and then 6 weeks of no rainfall and then a lot of rainfall and then none. Helene and then drought. Yeah. So on-farm disasters aren't necessarily new. And in North Carolina in particular, it's often the eastern part of the state that I think has had the most attention when it comes to hurricane disasters. They really take the brunt. But in a disaster event, different resources and financial assistance get activated, and it depends on the type of disaster event. So disasters, you can kind of consider them in two forms. There's acute, so they happen quickly, they're in and they're out, they can wreak havoc or they can hardly cause any damage at all. Or there's like a long-term disaster, things like drought or extended cold periods or extended periods of rainfall would be in that category of extended disasters. Whereas a lot of the disasters we think about are these like really short events: tornado, hurricane, flooding, hailstorm, So when a disaster event occurs, the Department of Agriculture relies on reports locally and how many farmers are affected by a weather event. And so in cases locally, if there is a really incredible storm that rips through the high country and 6 farmers in kind of one part of the county all call the Farm Service Agency and explain how they were affected, that starts to kind of activate that something has happened that's affected more than one farm. In the case of Helene, it's kind of no question of like the level of damage that was done. And so what this means for us right now is that everything that could possibly be activated to support farmers is in the works. Some programs are activated faster and some are not going to be available for months or even years. Some require Congress to pass a bill. Some require additional funding. Some already have funding set aside for these purposes. Okay, so one thing that I never want to assume is that everyone knows what Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resource Conservation Service is. So these are 2 agencies that fall under USDA. And if you think about USDA as this umbrella, we have Farm Service Agency, we have NRCS, we have risk management, and then there's other agencies within those. But these are some of the main ones, and these are the ones that activate federal financial assistance programs. FSA is largely known as the disaster responder, okay? And the programs that we find have the most positive effect for farmers right now lie within Farm Service Agency. Historically, what we know that comes 1 to 2 years after really extreme hurricanes are revenue loss programs. And so that's a big question for us right now. Like, how do I recover the cost of lost crops? Whether it was flood damage or rain saturation damage, or even now drought damage. And that is unknown at this time. But an exercise we're going to lead you through today should help you prepare for when those might get activated. So the best thing you can do right now, and the best thing you can do after any extreme weather event, is documentation. And so if any of you have been like working with some of us, that was the first point of contact we made with farmers in the region. So you document everything. You take photos, try to get a neighbor or a non-family member to take photos, and take a lot of written records of not just what has been affected, but what your farm looked like before the storm, down to how many 100-foot rows of broccoli and carrots and lettuce did you have planted, versus how many acres of a commodity crop, how many head of livestock and what type of livestock, how much feed did you have in storage. And our hope is that these programs will become available, and when they do, we'll be able to assist producers to apply. But at this time, like, this is kind of the realm we're working in. And NRCS traditionally is not an emergency response agency. They're here for the long haul. They're here to help you resolve your conservation challenges any day of the year. But what happens is farmers don't necessarily, they're not aware, or they're not even registered at Farm Service Agency. And so they think that this is the agency that's going to provide the support right now. So our goal today is to help you all, especially y'all as growers, understand exactly what these programs will cover, what they won't, and how they can actually complement each other. And then we're going to throw a couple of other things in the mix, like the Climate Smart projects, and other forms of assistance that are going to cover the losses or damages that like no other program seems to cover. And that relates to the questions on the wall, like, why are bridges a no man's land right now? What is covering road repair? And what about if I lost my farm stand? $20,000 project. So this being said, when we start high and we kind of understand why disaster programs are activated, and then we understand which ones are activated now for this event, it's going to help us kind of go deeper. But I want to share some time with Rachel to describe what's actually happening in the federal policy landscape right now after Helene. Because as we report what we've heard from farmers up, and as other agent or organizations do this as well, it actually has the ability to influence like some really quick top-down exceptions. They call these waivers. So right now, farmers who in this room who could not have applied to some of these programs before might be able to because there are more exceptions in place. Or if you've lost all of your documentation in the flooding, you might not be required to show the documentation otherwise needed. So I'd turn it over to Rachel for a few minutes to share.
Thanks, Jaimie. So again, I'm on our policy team, and there are 4 of us who work at RAFI specifically around federal policy. And since Helene hit, RAFI has been connecting with a lot of farmers over here to hear what is actually happening, what are the serious needs. So I have some of those to share with you today. And overall, our role in disaster relief is to make sure that we know how USDA uses relief services and how they might change, how they've historically used them in this certain instance, so people can understand how things have changed, what they need to do now, as well as understanding what farmers are experiencing on the ground, and what gaps they're experiencing in federal relief as they're trying to access things, as you're trying to access things, and realizing that maybe there are certain ineligibilities that are leaving you out. And we are specifically advocating for additional forms of relief that would be well-designed and targeted to deliver maximum assistance for producers that we're supporting. And what we've heard a lot of is that there are a lot of uninsured or underinsured producers that are falling through the cracks and not getting the support that they think that they had and they do need. So as we enter into a lame duck period in between these 2 administrations, there is an opportunity for some disaster relief packages to be passed. We are currently in touch with the senators and representatives in this area and starting to do meetings and chatting with them to share what we've heard from farmers and from you all, to let them know what we need, and what it could look like. So a couple of things that have been identified. One is the crop insurance and NAP that not enough people are enrolled. And so there's a lot of underinsured situations. We're pushing for revenue-based assistance that allows farmers to show the loss of revenue and get compensated for that revenue. That is something that is not currently available, but has been done in the past. And one thing we expect is for there to be a lot of block grants passed within this relief package. And that means that the federal government gives money to the state to decide what to do with it. But there can be stipulations on how it's used. And so we are pushing for it to be focused on long-term perennial systems that have been disrupted, or to aid in topsoil loss. So there's more soil programs around that. A few things, from what I've just shared, if you're wondering like why other things aren't included, please let me know. I'd love to add those to my list. If you're interested in staying involved or informed about what policy work we're doing, I have a sign-up sheet right here. We have a policy action network that you can sign up on our website as well, or just like make a note there so you can stay informed about action alerts. But as we move forward, there will be opportunities for farmers and for advocates to join us to talk with Congresspeople, to talk with folks about what they're actually experiencing, and that is a huge impact. Data points only can tell so much of a story, but having people who have actually experienced what's happening here actually makes things happen. So let me know if you'd like to be involved and if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so We have two growers in the room now. One was a Christmas tree grower, who might have stepped out. What I want to do is honor that, like, what's happened on your farms might not be what you want to share. Or you might have a scenario on your farm that you feel like is very practical for others to hear. And we use it kind of as an example to work through. So you're not obligated to share anything personal from your farm. What I might try to do is use some examples that I'm aware of from the county as like hypotheticals, and they may apply to your situation. And what we're going to do is try to help you understand how these different situations are going to kind of be filtered into specific programs. And the principal one is called the Emergency Conservation Program, ECP. This is a program that falls under FSA. This is where we start to get into detail. Okay. Anyone else aware of other FSA disaster programs? Yes, our agency folks can name them. Yeah, so name some of the others.
LIP and ELAP,
Okay, so what does LIP stand for?
Livestock Indemnity Program.
Okay. So when we hear livestock indemnity program, what should that signal to us? What does it mean?
Livestock death.
Okay, so per animal unit died in a weather event. In this case, it could have been flooding. It could have been your animals were released from a contained fencing unit and then died during escape or died during containment. Even would ELAP cover a situation where livestock eat contaminated forage and then die as a result? Would that be something covered under LIP?
Works for poisoning is covered. But for our area here, it's generally just weather related events.
Okay.
So
So if this situation applies to you, if you had livestock death, then you automatically fall under a potential eligibility for LIP, Livestock Indemnity Program. And that would be under FSA. And so you would talk to Sarah about eligibility for that. What about this acronym, ELAP?
Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. But
Okay.
it also covers livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish.
Okay, so that's where it's like, they start to sound similar, right? And how do you really distinguish them? So livestock assistance program, including honeybees and fish. So if you had feed in storage before the event, and this feed is destroyed as a result of flooding through your barn or wind that ripped off the roof, and if you have complete feed loss, but also if you have forage loss. So if you had any level of damage that has compromised your forage quality and it is no longer a feed source for your animals, you fall under this ELAP category. Okay. Then when we come to tree producers, there's a program called TAP, the Tree Assistance Program. So for producers who had fruit, nut, and ornamental trees, fall under the TAP program to replace and restore lost trees on the landscape. Sometimes the things that you would achieve under one of these programs, you can kind of also achieve under ECP. And ECP, Emergency Conservation Program, if you just heard the name, what do you think that program does for you? Emergency Conservation Program. Does it tell you much? It really doesn't. It's really vague. So emergency conservation program's purpose is to restore your farm infrastructure and conservation structures to its prior functioning. And there's several pillars of ECP, but they depend on each disaster. So the ones we're going to focus on today are 4 of them. And I'm going to divide this chart into 4 lines. And we're gonna use some real examples from the area to understand how they qualify for ECP. So we're gonna call this EC1, EC2, EC3, and EC4. Now, if anyone would mind, whether you're a farmer or not, could you name a type of damage or loss that you've witnessed or experienced on farm after Helene? Erosion. Okay. Where did that erosion happen? In the watershed, meaning where on your farm? Right through the center. So what eroded the soil? Okay, so water. So water-based erosion. What happened to the sediment after it left its original place? Okay, so it has potentially left your property. Okay, you've lost a conservation structure. You've lost topsoil in this case, okay? Okay, so now we're hearing a couple of different things. So I'm gonna start making notes. And what we're gonna do is see if we see any trends emerge, okay? So we have topsoil lost. But let's say that didn't leave your property and instead it mounded up over here against this fence line. Maybe you had like deer fencing. Or it's mounded up now against a farm structure. Or in your crop field, you have this, uneven terrain. You have gullies, you have mounds where basically rivers and creeks ripped through and changed the terrain. Okay, so these are gonna fall in a couple of different places. So we've got uneven soil. Okay, and then I heard rock. Okay, we're gonna call this debris. That's rock debris. What are other kinds of debris? Okay, sand is a debris, yeah. Sand and silt.
Trees or limbs.
Trees,
Vehicles, structures.
limbs, okay. So kind of two kinds of trash potentially. Trash from on your farm and trash from off your farm. Okay. With trees, there's varying sizes, right? There's the massive maple tree that's fallen, right? And maybe it collapsed a fence line. But there's also like piles of sticks and grasses and scrub that is also now mounded on fence lines or deposited here and here and here. With the sand and silt in particular, we have sand and silt falling in this category of debris. Okay, so now I'm going to title this one debris. And then we've got sand and silt that is just uneven. Okay. And this can be in what kind of places? Where on the farm would you see uneven soil that would impede your ability to go back into production? Where? In the fields, okay. Fields is one.
Pastures,
In pastures.
roads.
Roads, that's not gonna count in this category, right? You think we're on farm roads?
So there's gray area in the handbook. If that farm road is your only access point,
Mhm.
we can do some shaping and practice for that as well. So
Okay, so farm road only. Okay, what other kind of damages or losses?
Fence.
Fence, okay. Fence is gonna fall in its entirely unowned category. What's happened to fence lines?
Missing or torn down by some of the debris.
So there's missing or damaged. And what kind of fences? Okay. Electric? What kind of electric? Okay, so cattle, multi-strand. Poultry netting. If anyone's had like solar poultry netting systems or they use them for their sheep. What other kind of fence?
Crop netting in that too.
Crop netting,
Yeah,
like a wildlife exclusion fence? Mhm.
or the kind of netting that you put over to keep stuff out of. Like your,
I don't think that would count. No. But yes, so basically, when you think about the kind of fencing that's meant to either contain livestock, exclude predators, or exclude pests in terms of deer, that's the kind of repair that you could achieve under this category, EC3. Okay, so what we often hear from farmers, whether it's in a disaster scenario or beforehand, is like, I heard from my neighbor that such and such can help me with topsoil or compost. Such and such helped me build my fence. So in this case, one thing we'd want to clarify is that like Farm Service Agency doesn't actually help you build a fence, right? The way this program is structured is that based on the volume of debris that's been deposited on your property, or the amount or like depth of soil that now needs to be graded, the linear feet of fence line missing or needing repair. And then we'll get to this unique category over here. These are all measurable. And Farm Service Agency needs to know what amount of damage there was, or what kind of loss there was to be able to measure it and effectively calculate a payment. So when you have documented your damage, and the next step is to call FSA and to report the types of damages and losses, immediately after a disaster, it might be all you can do at that time. And the agency has to figure out actually how to serve you with the most appropriate programs. The next stage is going back and defining in detail what has happened on your farmland. And what I've seen Sarah be able to do is to distill what's happened on your land into what you're eligible for. Okay, but you're going to be asked questions on the spot by someone like Sarah that if you didn't know you're going to be asked in advance, you might not be able to accurately measure it at the time. And so the example might be, how many cubic yards of rock do you have to remove? Does anyone know how to measure cubic yards of rock? It's not really like a common practice, right? Or, huh?
Measure it now.
Yeah. Trees and limbs. We have every size of tree and limb that's been deposited or has done damage. So the biggest thing you can do to help yourself to apply is to take some time to measure the damage before you get to the time of applying. And this program is not like filling out a typical like program application form like you would do kind of in normal times, where you could find it online on your own, you could complete it with someone's help and turn it into the office. This application is done through an in-person appointment. In some regions, I think they're doing them remotely, like over the phone, but Sarah's going to pull up a property map of your farm, and she's going to ask you to indicate, where do you have sand and silt? Where do you have rock? Where do you have trees and limbs? Where do you have trash? Now, Sarah's exceptional at her job. In some places, if you don't go into the office prompting the agent to ask you these things, you might not be asked. Okay, so if you know in advance that these are the categories that of debris that ECP can assist you with removing and disposing of, then you prompt Farm Service Agency instead of waiting for them to prompt you. Okay. And the same thing goes for a lot of other federal programs. The more you know going into it, the more you can prompt them to give you the answers that are up here, but they just can't think of them on the spot. Okay, so if you already know that you have sand and silt on your property, I wanted to give you a piece of scratch paper to go ahead and make these categories that apply to your farm. Okay. Okay, so what I want you to do, you can either do this one of two ways. You could quickly draw a very rough sketch of your farmland. And we're gonna mark on your kind of your aerial farm map where you have damage, loss, and debris. The other way you can do this is kind of by list category. If you do it by map, it's going to be somewhat similar to what you do with Sarah when you make an appointment. But doing it by list might be good if like you're kind of a linear thinker. So we're gonna go through and kind of one by one. If you have sand or silt that has been deposited on the farm and it's at a depth that you can't just reshape it with a piece of equipment or a hand rake, and it actually needs to be removed from point A to point B. That might be off farm or somewhere else on your farmland. Write down sand and silt and write down where those places are on your property. Because when you get to Sarah's office and she's pulling up your farm and track map, and maybe it looks like this, you're gonna need to be prepared to say, I have sand and silt deposited over here and over here, like that. And someone like Sarah is gonna ask you what the volume of that sand and silt is. And now after a month of drought, this gets a little bit tricky. So in the early stages, it was kind of obvious to see just like the volume of muck that was deposited in places, right? But now we might start to see it shrinking and cracking, okay? Which also means it's going to be harder to excavate. So in order for FSA to help you remove debris that doesn't belong on your farm, either somewhere else on your farm or off the farm, they're working under the assumption that you're going to need a certain type of equipment to do it. And the only way that they can help you, the same way they help you, is if they create a somewhat universal payment scenario, okay? So to remove sand and silt, they're going to assume it's going to take a certain type of machine, and it's going to take the runtime of that machine. It's going to take somebody's labor to operate the machine. And then it's going to need to be trucked off in some fashion. So Sarah, would you share like what is the measurement for sand and silt?
Yeah, sand and silt would be between 12 to 30 inches or greater than 30 inches. And we measure it by acreage. So if you have even square footage, we can convert it into acreage. If you have it on the farm map, I can draw it in as a polygon and get kind of a pretty good estimate of that area.
Right. So you need to be able to say, over here, I have 12 to 30 inches of sand and silt removed. And she might say, well, what is it over here? And like, oh, well, that's like probably 30 inches deep. Now, based on the drought conditions we've had, is it this volume at the time of the hurricane event or what they see right now when they apply?
You can tell me what it was at the time.
Okay.
That's fine.
So if you know in advance the depth and where it is and have an approximation, you might have an acreage approximate, but you might not. If you're sitting with your FSA employee and you're doing this over the mapping software, Sarah can drop these points and it's going to calculate the acreage payment. So you would be applying for an EC1 payment for sand and silt removal at a particular depth on a certain level acreage. That's going to generate a payment value. Okay. So now let's move on to rock. So Sarah is a good agent. She prompts you to think about where rock has been deposited. And maybe you didn't have any rock and you say no rock. But let's say that you had the creek wash through this section of your farm and now you have stone all through here. Okay. Does it matter what size stone or is it just the cubic volume?
Rocks and boulders.
Okay.
Yeah.
So same thing, this is going to be, your payment for rock removal is going to be based on the assumption it's going to take you a certain type of equipment, a certain number of person hours and fuel cost to get this removed and where it gets removed to. Okay, so one thing that you might start to hear in the community is, yeah, FSA paid for my chainsaw fuel. Did FSA pay you for your chainsaw fuel? No. They likely made a payment for tree and limb debris removal. But if you heard this from a friend and you call your farm service agency and the very first thing you get out of your mouth is, I heard this, does FSA help me with that? Depending on who you get, the answer might actually be no. No, we don't pay for chainsaw fuel. And so when we imagine after a disaster event and just like the hormones pulsing through our body and the adrenaline rush, and we're just trying to find answers fast, and we're trying to find them from the first person that can tell us, sometimes we're not asking the right question to the right person. And depending on the person you get on the other end of the line, they actually might not hear what's behind your question, right? You're trying to understand how to remove the trees on your property, but what they heard you ask is, do I pay for fuel? And the answer is no. And so that's where people will sometimes experience that no and feel like this agency can't help me and like throw your hands up and walk away. Okay, so that's why we're kind of like pulling the curtain back a little bit. You have a question?
Yes, so. On our farm, it's had damage, but nothing catastrophic. So first off, we're like, well, there's more people that need this than we do at this time.
Mhm.
But what I've kind of gathered is you guys need reporting from everything.
I'd say, what's your perspective?
Yeah, and there's enough funding for.
That's what I mean.
everybody.
It sounds like that affects the funding.
Yeah,
Mhm.
well, and right now especially, we're trying to make sure all of the applications and needs assessments are in, because once you've signed that, we can allocate that funding. That's
Okay.
grabbed and held back.
And so then that, my other question is for applying and such, at what stage do we cut the trees and clear the land first, or do we need to apply first?
Yeah, I would apply as soon as you can.
Okay,
Great
And that way
question.
we have that in and,
okay.
Yeah.
So that would be the first step, is to talk to you, to the
Yeah.
FSA.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
that's what I needed to know.
Yeah.
Because beyond, after it happened, I was getting so many emails of there's help here, and I'm like, I don't even know where to get. I don't even know who to call or who to start with.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're running 2 months after this disaster now. And so, I've been remedying everything that I can already.
Yeah.
So I made sure to take out my phone and take pictures
Yes. Yes.
of everything that I'm doing.
And so this is how these programs are designed to kind of work one way at face value. But when you apply them on a geography like the high country and the types of farms we have in the high country, a lot of diversified small scale operations, and the just grit and resilience that exists in this community, like we've seen in a lot of places, the response was fast, right? People got out their saws and their equipment and started helping each other fast. And that's why that documentation step is so critical, because if someone like our policy team members communicate up the chain nationally to say, these farms don't have time to wait on this to get your permission to clean up the tree on their fence line. This farm doesn't have time to get your permission to remove the rock debris to restore their farm to operation. So what happens then is nationally they consider, do we need to create an exception in this scenario? And they have. So the result we have now is you might have already done this work. So if any one of these staff came out to your farm, it probably looks very different right now than it looked October 3rd, right? Okay, so that witness is not required, but that documentation is. And your testimony, even if it's just written, like what you're doing right now, where is your sand and silt? How many inches? How many acres area? Or where is the extent of the rock damage or tree limbs and debris? Then she has the documentation she needs, and it needs to be backed up in photos and that written testimony. Now, let's say in this case, the rock isn't still sitting around. Your buddy brought their skid steer over and you have effectively moved all of the rock debris. If you have pictures, you have the evidence that it was there. And let's say you took notes on the number of hours your buddy came over and worked and the number of hours their machine ran. You keep the receipts of the fuel. You now have documentation of the work you had to do to remove it. And with the exceptions we have in place right now, you could still apply to these programs if you've already accomplished the work, but you have to have the documentation to back it up. So some key things to think about: if you had volunteer teams on your farm, if you do not have a record already of the hours they spent, or family members who've spent time cleaning up debris, or you had a contractor already come, you need to make a record of that now and make it as detailed as possible. But even volunteer members' time spent on that cleanup is going to count. Okay. Yeah.
If you had volunteers come from out of state, does their transportation costs count for that?
It's more like the time. It's based on the time they spent on the farm. Do you want to say?
Yeah, it's it's for the labor.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say, if either of you used any volunteers from Berwea, we can provide our record of it too, if that's helpful.
Awesome.
Just let me know, because we have names, phone numbers, dates and times, but not super specific, but we can definitely share that.
Like that's all Meredith's first look at that too.
Okay, good. So some things to think about with trees and limbs is there's different sizes of trees and limbs. So you need a record of, did you have something that was more than 6 inches in diameter? Did you have something that was more of like that limb size? So think about like the size of your arm, or did you have like scrubby debris? And you need to know where it was on your property. So is it piled up here because that's where that creek made its exit? And is it deposited here? And this one's measured in, remind me, acre. Okay, so once again, when you're sitting with Sarah in an appointment, if you don't come with a written list of these things, it might not come to mind. And she's serving so many customers, it's really difficult to remember to prompt every single person to think about every single one of these categories. So if you can go ahead and have either a list or on a map where the debris, the tree and vegetation debris is, she's going to be able to make some points on the map and say, okay, that is tree debris. And then trash is by the foot.
It's square foot, so we have scattered debris removal, which is something that you can walk and pick up by hand. And then we have heavy scattered debris, so that's something we assume you'll need an excavator, to get out.
Okay,
Terry, you said that was heavy scattered debris and light.
No, I have a question.
Yeah.
So we specifically lost 400 feet of culvert pipe
okay,
that had been installed into the low-lying areas of the watershed.
okay,
And we have a pond. And pond filled twice its capacity and reached.
okay,
All that water, all that pressure was up high. As it tried to travel through Nelson Sea property. It blew out everywhere, it was buried underground. And it was galvanized metal pipes. Yeah. And so they exploded under the pressure and they were like shooting water out of there everywhere. So I bought $13,000 worth of new culvert pipe and had it installed
mhm,
to protect any further damage from the watershed. And that watershed runs right down. So all the soil that I had spent 25 years building.
Yep.
I would say it's a large percentage. 40%,
so
and I'm not sure how culvert pipes fall in this.
pond does,
Yeah.
so if you need, probably like lining, regrading the sides, that definitely does. Culverts right now is in this like lost pit of also like access roads, road repair. There may be some things coming out from the State Department of Ag related to road repair, but I haven't heard anything about culverts.
Well, and we can do the stabilizing, shaping, some grading practices for your farmers and the trail accessing.
Yeah, we lost our road too.
Okay,
Pond.
7 million ounces of gravel. Um, No, it was, close to 700,000 pounds of stone and gravel. Anytime
mhm.
gravel.
And is all of that stone deposited and then scattered, or is it
Well,
just
it's-
gone?
It's no longer on my specific property, but it's on the neighbor's property.
Mhm.
So it went from one location to another location.
Okay.
Which technically, that's my property on his property.
Mhm.
I don't know how that works. But yeah, we've remedied a lot of the damage already,
Mhm.
but there's still some stuff to do.
So what I'd hope for anyone like you who has done a lot of remedy already, and especially remedy for the things that like might not be the most expensive, but if you could apply with Sarah, then these are going to add up, okay? And it's a reimbursement style program. So if you have already done the work, you've expended the time, the fuel cost, and essentially, if you can demonstrate that these are complete and you have the documentation to show it, the process kind of goes like this. You still have to apply, but you need to differentiate between what you have completed and what still needs to be done. And whatever you have completed, Sarah pushes over to what's called the county committee. So the Farm Service Agency is a county committee. This is the group that actually decides if this is going to be reimbursed or not. They're supposed to follow your guidance, but they meet once a month. And so if you can get your application in and demonstrate what is completed by the time that county committee happens, that would expedite a payment. What we don't know, I haven't heard, is how long it takes to actually receive a payment.
So there are a couple of steps involved. So that initial application, it has to go to a needs assessment. And my county executive director would be the one to go back through and say, okay, this is what they requested, this is what they need to get. And then that goes to the county committee initially for them to approve. Once you say you've completed everything and we get your documentation, then we have to hold that and wait until the county committee meets again. So they can approve the actual payment. So it's like a 2-month process.
But I'd want to encourage you that it's not, if you've had experience with other federal programs that you felt like were really poor paying, this isn't the case. Like the payments are worthwhile. And so if you had this kind of damage or losses, it's worth getting your documentation organized and trying to maximize what your payment might be by like leaving no rock unturned, basically. So EC2 is the category of leveling and grading soil that is now misshapen. That's not this kind of sand and silt removal, right? Like this is the pretty deep level of sand and silt that needs to be moved from point A to point B using machinery. This is soil that is uneven and you need to grade it so that you can now reshape beds, apply topsoil or compost, and begin production again, or to reshape your pastures to prepare for an annual cover crop or perennial planting so that you can return to grazing. You have a question?
Well, so through our property, there's a creek, which obviously it got washed out and been diverted and everything. Where would that qualify?
You got the creek washed out,
I mean, we've had erosion like creek banks.
creek banks.
erosion.
Okay. Creek banks is another tricky one right now. There's a couple of different ways to skin that cat. And it's one we're kind of figuring out right now with some like other hypothetical scenarios in the county. So I could probably talk with you one-on-one after, but so this practice is by the acre, right? Okay, so you need to come in knowing or already one of two things. You need to come in to Sarah for your appointment, denoting same thing, where on this property do you have leveling and grading? So maybe you had sand and silt debris here and here that needs to be removed, but you have gullies washed here where the water exited. And you need to come and you need to re-level this to prepare for planting. You need to be able to indicate on the map this total area so that Sarah can calculate the acreage needing leveling and grading. Okay. And that goes for fields or pastures. Okay. And then it would also help you apply the seed and fertilizer to cover the soil. Okay. Do you want to say anything more about how that payment's kind of structured?
No, if you have slides at all, mudslides or landslides, we can also add in a stabilizing practice. And then the shaping, grading, and the tillage for the seeding.
Meaning she'd apply a payment for that. It's gonna be up to you to do it or find the contractor to do it. But, right, so.
Jaimie, can I ask a question about that?
Mhm.
For the stabilizing piece, can that also count for the stream restoration? Is that only for like landslide, mudslide scenario?
This would only apply in field and pasture, yeah. So we're gonna get to this really fuzzy one here, and this is where the stream bank situations lie, okay? So last one is fence. We know it's can cover missing or damaged. Here are the key things you need to know before you talk to FSA. You need to know how many linear feet of your fence line is damaged or missing. Even if it's the smallest amount, like you said, like there's assistance for this. Try to reap some of the benefit of it. So your linear feet and the height of that fence. And if you had multiple different types of fences, you need to do this for each individual fence. So let's say you had 100 feet of poultry netting. You need to write down the linear feet and the brand and see if you can come up with even a rough estimate of what that cost. If it had a solar charging box to it, include that too. So Sarah will be able to say, okay, you qualify for the poultry style electric netting and the solar charger box payment. Okay. Same goes for if you have sheep, not just poultry. If you have barbed wire, or multi-strand fence line, I've heard Sarah ask, how many strands of wire? And if you're sitting there in her office and you have a 40-acre farm, is that gonna come to mind? So try to know that kind of thing in advance. So the type of fence, and if you have multiple types of fences, each of these types, the linear feet and the height. Okay, and then if there were electrical components to them, the value of those. So fence is kind of the easiest.
Yeah, and just if it's repair versus replace, if you replace it, then we can also put in a fence removal practice with that for the same amount of feet. But if you're just repairing, it drops that cost share payment down to 25% instead of the 75% or 90%.
So think carefully, is that fence really in the condition to keep serving your production needs, or does it really need to be repaired? So it's great if you did a quick repair, but does it actually need replacement? Like, this is the time to make that decision.
Good question.
Mhm.
I lost about 80 shiitake logs. And they were in stream,
Uh-huh,
so they could stay moist.
uh-huh.
They're not there anymore.
I bet they're not. That would be specialty crop loss. And so that's falls into this category of there is no program to hold that right now. But the thing you can do is just take as many notes as you can. So note the location. If you want to go out there and even put a GPS pinpoint to where it was and write that down, but the number of logs and your estimated value of the production from those logs. So try to base that estimation on a prior year. So if you were at that same level of production, 80 logs, what did you reap from that? If you were at half that production last year when you harvested, have the documentation that you had 40 logs, but you are estimating the doubled value. Yeah. I'm sorry.
They're all in the pond.
I'm so sorry.
Know how to get them out. Without a canoe. Or
Yeah.
something floating, so I can go out there and
Well, and they're considered contaminated. So anything that came into contact with floodwater shouldn't be for human consumption and really even shouldn't be for livestock consumption. If it was inundated from rainfall, that's determined on a case by case basis. But if it was in contact with floodwater, it's now waste product. Might count as debris removal
yes,
over
it
here.
does have to be removed from the pond.
Would you count it?
If it's in the pond.
They're all sitting out there. There's limbs, there's leaves, there's wood chips, there's all kinds of trash in the pond. And it's silt in the pond as well. And so I think we're at a 14-foot depth prior. Now we might be 8 feet,
Okay,
That's,
not really measure.
yeah,
that would require engineering,
Yeah.
wouldn't it, over here?
and it's, we have a lot of payment scenarios, but that doesn't mean there's one that fits you exactly. And that's why we're asking for you to keep track of your labor, what equipment you're using, so we can match you as closely as we can.
Yeah.
So we can get you that 75% cost share of what work you've done and what expenses you've had. So,
So in terms of a pond, does it have to be like a production pond? If you have to have fish in it, or you have to have fowl in it, or it has to be being used to water livestock, or if people have ponds that were damaged and their only real purpose was for agritourism, then how does that work?
They'd have to be for ag use, somehow for ag use, whether you're irrigating with them or.
So in the conservation perspective, a pond exists to reduce insufficient water supply for either crop watering or livestock watering. So, that's a conservation structure to improve your water availability. In the agritourism isn't my body of work, so I just don't want to answer that for you. But if the pond was serving a wildlife purpose, if they had done any like intentional planting around the pond here to create wildlife habitat, then that's a conservation structure. So let's, before we adjourn, let's talk about EC4. And, do you feel like you have sufficient notes from these three? Okay, I'm gonna kind of erase it.
And I was just taking notes too.
Okay.
Will be shared with whoever wants to.
Thank you, thank you. And I have a template, I have a digital template that I can send you both that helps you itemize these categories so that you can print it, you can bring a computer, and you're not having to rely on 5 pages of handwritten notes, but you have this kind of catalog of things to bring. So EC4. EC4 is, all of these had names, right? This was debris removal, this is leveling and grading, this was fence repair or restoration. EC4 is restoration of conservation structures. And it has taken over a month and a half to figure out what this means. So Sarah started with early guidance on like a bullet point list of common farm features that could be restored through the ECP program. So things like ponds, berms, terraces, anything that had been established through some level of engineering or earthworks. And now we understand there's actually some more things that this practice can cover. And one of the things I want to highlight is vegetative cover. So we have EC4. And when you think about features of your farm that serve some kind of infrastructural or conservation purpose, they may or may not fall on this list. We have a printout that does include what is on the list. I don't think it was updated at the time I printed it, but the important one that I think could apply to several of you is the vegetative cover. So when you think about areas of your farm, and we'll draw that same kind of farm plot here. If this is the normal waterway along your farm, and you have crop production kind of up to about here, I imagine this was not bare soil before the storm, correct? Some kind of perennial grass, there may be some invasives. If this is a woody and vegetated area, you likely have a mix of native and non-native species. But this area between your production land and a water body in particular is already sensitive before a storm, and now you might have nothing but sand and silt covering those perennial grasses. You might have intentionally planted a stream buffer with native species. And now all of that is gone. In these scenarios, EC4 could help you recover the cost of replanting these areas. Now, one thing that's getting really tricky and we're hearing all over is think about the horizontal plane of a creek and the bank and the land after. So we're going to use this example. Okay, here's someone else's property. We have the creek bank, creek bed, bank, and then the rise onto the farmland. Okay, this is a crop area. This is the creek bottom or the creek bed. Okay. It could look like so many different things right now. This creek bed could now be at this level. This creek bed could be deeper. This entire bank may have previously looked like this, but now it is this steep drop. But regardless, when you're thinking about how you can restore like these areas of your farm, you've got to think about it in some zones. Certain zones are going to require engineering level work and may require a permit. And there's a lot not determined yet in the county about what is going to be allowed without a permit. And what can be allowed with federal funding or state funding or by any other means. So when it comes to this, there may need to be excavation, pulling this material out to restore the creek bed to the level it was. There may need to be grading and then stabilization to get this bank to its natural slope. And then we may need to plug these areas with shrubs, trees, and grasses to restore the riparian buffer. You could apply to FSA tomorrow to do some vegetative cover here. But if you have a serious issue in these two zones and somebody comes back and tells you you need pretty significant engineering level work and it's going to require to rip out this section, you've just done yourself a pretty big disfavor. Okay, there's going to be a couple of programs that could assist with this like really critical area. Okay, so we're going to call this for practical purposes the riparian zone. ECP is not the only way to assist you with this zone. Okay, so NRCS is actually the typical group that would help you establish riparian buffer here in the creek. And they're going to be able to assist with this, but their timeline might not work in your favor, and it might not work as fast as you want it to. EC4 might actually be able to help you do this faster, but if you do it before you have really determined the needs of this zone, that's where you might get into a little bit of trouble. So at this time, our recommendation is that if you have anywhere on your farm that you are trying to get root systems reestablished and coverage to reduce more soil loss, that you do it through EC4 at this time. Because remember, this is under the agency that's equipped for emergency response. So they are in theory going to be able to help you financially faster. They are using the same conservation practices that NRCS is, but we have a handout on the table that walks you through what the annual process is for NRCS. If you feel like you're going to need work anywhere in this zone, or you even need cover crop applied here, or you need some topsoil regeneration here, I want you to bear in mind applying for the NRCS assistance. Your deadline's been extended, which is a huge help, but it also means the ranking process, the competitive process it is also extended. So the sooner you can get an application in, the better. But you need to establish very good communication between NRCS and FSA. Because let's say to accomplish vegetative cover here, you apply for something called conservation cover. If you apply conservation cover to 1,000 linear feet of this zone, up and down your farm, if you get that through ECP, you can't get it through NRCS. It's double dipping. And so while back and forth conversation with Sarah or FSA might sound like vegetative cover, pay attention to the actual conservation practice names. Because if you're going over to NRCS to ask for assistance, you have to know where you are applying it and make sure you don't apply it in the same place.
I got an RCS question. So
Yeah.
we applied for 2024. And we got actually, I picked up the letter, the post office morning that funding is all out. Because of this situation, you think there'll be additional funding?
For which specifically? Was it
Well, this was for putting in livestock water systems
Okay, and was that through NRCS or through soil and water conservation?
in RCS.
It was NRCS.
We are told that they are advocating for further funding.
Okay.
It's just about getting it. And they have set aside funding for Western North Carolina through the EQIP program. It's not enough to cover everything, but they're doing that as just the start before they can get legislation to pass further disaster funds. So we do anticipate further funding.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
But if you did have any livestock watering or crop watering systems, so this applies to both of you. If you had a water well, if you had pipeline, if you had troughs, any of these components, if you had micro irrigation systems that were compromised, this is also going to fall under EC4.
Okay.
Okay,
But new systems.
new
would follow
systems
under NRCS.
fall under NRCS, correct. But essentially, right now, you have a better advantage. Normally, you'd be competing with other people across the state for assistance
That's what
in
I'm
livestock.
wondering.
Right now, you're gonna be competing against like 30 counties. So you have better likelihood, and you have better likelihood of getting NRCS assistance. And in a cropland setting, I wrote down the topsoil piece here because I wanted to come back to it. There's no practice for recovering topsoil under EC4, but there's a couple of ways to do this. So there's a practice at NRCS called soil carbon amendment. Soil carbon amendment can help you apply compost, whether it's I think a 50-50 mix or pure compost to your beds to help start restoring the organic matter. It's not going to replace 25 years worth, right? It's nowhere near it. But you could apply for that under NRCS. That one is called a climate smart practice. That's not to be confused with the climate smart project. It just means it has this climate benefit to it. That also has a higher likelihood of receiving funding. So this is one you particularly should have in mind to apply for. But you apply now, it's not going to be ranked and you're not going to be notified. When do you think someone would be notified?
If they got ranked.
If they are pre-approved and they know that NRCS is going to help reimburse them.
April or May.
Okay, can you wait till April or May? You might. So the Climate Smart project that Working Landscapes is doing and what RAFI is doing, you could apply for that same practice. The thing I'd want you to know is that then you can apply to NRCS for it at that same crop land. Okay, so don't double dip.
If I'm already part of the climate,
Mhm.
I've already given this mulching
Okay,
techniques to build topsoil. Well,
no, not necessarily. I would definitely talk to Rachel about what could be adapted if it's a contract, what could be adapted at this stage to help include soil carbon amendment. And if it can't be, enroll in another project. And essentially, these projects are allowing NRCS to get these practices on the ground and getting the funding out the door outside of their typical ranking process. So you could also try to do it through NRCS, but realistically, I'd want you to know, like, that assistance, you're not going to have funds in hand until, maybe May if you're lucky. But if you don't rank well enough, you'll be like Brad here, who gets a letter in September, finally finding out that you're not getting that assistance. So, the key thing is not missing that deadline. I have a couple of printed applications with me, so you can take home. Your application is going to roll over, but you need to talk to NRCS if there's anything about your application that you want to amend. Okay, because your application that rolled over is what you applied for basically in like 2023 when we were working on that together. So your needs might have changed and they need to know that now.
Okay.
Okay. So I hope this has kind of started to like peel back the curtain a little bit on what exactly falls under the emergency conservation program. I can send you the template. Just indicate here that you want it. So we can send it to you by email. And then I'm not going to be in office, but Liz would be able to work with you over the phone, or like we could stay here right now and just go through and start getting things filled in that template. So you have it kind of in an organized.
yeah, because that's, the sort of used at this point. Like,
I understand.
where is the starting line and where's the finish?
Okay,
You know, I've seen a lot of different tiers, I've seen a lot of different things that I need to look at, but ultimately, I have my records.
hmm
Does an inspector come to the farm? Can I request that? So that, is that you?
Yeah, so for you, and you called, I have put in a receipt for service the first time we talked. And when you listed all of your damage and what you were putting in place and sort of the steps you had to take because you needed to fix it at that time. For you, Ed, I would have NRCS come out because they'll be our technical advisors for any pond work, or anything like that. And I can come with them so we can just come out and see what's going on and see what work you've already had to do. And they can give you some technical advice. Then we would all have a better idea of what next step is and what the next bit of work will be for you.
And you've got all that mapped already.
I sent it to you, I emailed it to you. And then
I
Well, you got it.
I just haven't.
okay. Did the passcode work?
Obviously, maybe it's not expired now.
Oh, you're good.
So how many applications do you have for that?
Probably close to 100 at the time. I service Avery County too, so I've been working out of Avery County a day or two a week. So it's been,
So with your workload that's pre-existing right now, should I call you? Should I bug you now?
I will make a note, they do have quite a big on-site inspection list right now. So we might not be able to get to you till
Till January.
January-ish.
Schedule that.
We're
January.
trying to get as quick as we can for the application deadline. For the starting programs.
So I guess the first step is getting with you, completing the application. Cause I need you to hold my hand. I don't wanna make any mistakes and I don't wanna do something stupid that's gonna keep me from getting on.
And we
And I
can,
will, if I do it on my own, I will make mistakes.
And I know I stepped out and there was like something about the working landscapes, climate smart project. Just might be easier to like say it to the group. What was there, are you wanting to know if you can switch practices next year?
Well, I don't want to switch practices, but my question was, if I'm already part of the carbon amendment to build topsoil, like I'm doing the program, I can't be funded twice for doing the same activity.
Not with, so if you have like you have a couple acres under cultivation.
Yeah.
So if we're paying you for 1 acre of soil carbon amendment, you can get paid from NRCS for the other acre for soil carbon.
Mhm.
So you can't double dip on the same piece of land, but we could also pay you for a different practice. You can switch your practice year to year. So if you wanted to do like cover crop from us and soil carbon amendment from them, you can.
Okay, so we just switch like a crop rotation.
Yeah, like I'll definitely be reaching out to all of y'all to see what practices, if you want to switch your practices. Some have a lifespan and you can't do them a couple, 2 years in a row, but some of them you can do every year.
So you're talking about applying those practices, which would be different than if you were applying that practice to an acre and then the acre washed away, and so you're gonna have to apply it again. So if that washed away, then Sarah, that would be you, right? That would be FSA in the ECP for what was damaged in the storm. So could you get that funding again for the same area if they turned it over?
And for ECP, you can't double dip with other federal cost share programs. But state funded programs.
I feel like the question though is like, say, Climate Smart paid for the original application, and then all of what you put down washed away. Can ECP then pay to replace that? Or does it have to still come from Climate Smart again?
It depends on what you're trying to replace. So we know like there's no practice for just topsoil replacement under ECP. So let's say there's 3 crop fields here. And Ed, can we use your example?
Yes.
So what's Rachel, what is Ed's climate smart enrollment for one field? You know?
I think off the top of my head, you're doing cover crop
Okay,
and,
Crop rotation,
okay,
and then we're doing.
cover, and then soil carbon amendment. I can look in your file, I can open it up.
okay. So a couple are management practices. Crop rotation is a management practice. It's nothing physical here. ECP can't help you with that. The ones I want to think about are the on the ground applications that you paid out of pocket or through grant funding to apply. So in the case that you applied cover crop, soil carbon amendment, mulching, anything that has washed away, I would have the conversation with Rachel, and then Rachel can take that to her team of, is there funding in place to help me restore what I lost through the Climate Smart program? That's going to be the fastest way to get that back on site. It's going to be way faster than NRCS directly. If the answer is, I'm not sure, what it means is they're likely having to communicate to their NRCS regional or national contact to see if they could use their funding this way. So it might not be an immediate answer, but I think the time to wait for an answer is still going to be faster than getting an answer from NRCS. That doesn't mean you can't put an application in. So when you put in an application in for NRCS assistance, you're not bound to a contract. And you can pull back at any time you want. So in the case of, we should probably chat about cover crop really quickly though. Because if you had cover crop in this field, or you had crops in this field, and then flooding has washed it, the leveling and grading that you might need to do to reshape this field includes a payment for cover crop. So you can come back and apply seed here, but it has to be annual, I think, it's the scenario, okay? And you can even apply an amendment to help it. The time of year right now, though, like you have a very narrow window, so.
Yeah, we've already tried, and we got some germination,
Yeah,
but it's under snow right now, it's very tender.
okay.
I don't know what's gonna happen there.
So if you have documented, and if you haven't, you document now with us that you have reshaped this plot and you've reapplied cover crop. And that's the documentation Sarah needs to see to help you qualify for that payment. But that means that you have cover crop here on this parcel. And that means that NRCS can't help you with cover crop here in 2025, okay? But you've got to know how these tracks are broken up with FSA and kind of how the lines are drawn. But Liz and I would be happy now, like at this point, we could just sit down with each of you if you want and go through any scenarios just in more detail. And if it's also like, I'm exhausted, this is a lot, I'm checking out, then Liz would be following up with you just over the phone. But she'd be going down kind of the same type of list, either kind of type by type or walk me visually through your farm and tell me where the damages were. And she would do the work of kind of taking all of those damages, losses, and then sorting them into these columns that we did here. We're trying to kind of reduce the headache of doing that.
That would be helpful, big real.
Okay.
It's always hard to visualize a scenario if you're not there, because.
Yeah.
So that's why I was asking about an inspector. You know, somebody's gonna come on site and actually, you know, communicate human level instead of email, ideas, words.
And we're entering the phase, like you said, what do I do when? You took care of the first steps, like documentation and reporting, you did that. they've also had to get a handle of what they can even offer you and like getting organized and starting to schedule. So the best thing now you can do is get on their schedule, but that doesn't stop you from getting technical expertise from other places. So like Mountain True, who oversees Watauga County Riverkeeper here, Andy, they can actually come out and advise about this like kind of riparian area restoration. Something that Jim will probably bring to that group meeting December 19th is, what do we do about these zones in our watershed that need hundreds of thousands of dollars of repair? And not just on your land, but your neighbor's land and your neighbor's land and your neighbor's land, so that we don't have this level of destruction in just the next heavy rainfall. But
And that's what we're trying to correct over
mhm,
situation. I've had two track hose working pretty consistently, bury these pipes. And originally we had an 18-inch discharge. Now we went to a 24. So we went up 6 inches. It would move the water necessary. But we switched to a material called slip wall, which is ABS plastic. Doesn't have ribs in the pipe.
okay,
So any aggregate, any rocks, debris isn't gonna sit there and chew the flow of water. It's not gonna sit there and aggravate that pipe.
mhm,
It's not gonna cause any degradation.
mhm.
It's gonna flow right on through, like a shotgun barrel.
Yeah.
Boom.
And it's bigger now, so you've got more water able to flow through at once too.
Right. And so, trying to divert the water so that it doesn't cut any more land ever in the future, because history tells us if we experience something once, it's probably going to come again at some time.
Right.
Will it be more intense? It could be.
Right.
Not once, it happened again. So we try to build it to handle more flow in the future than what it failed at disposing of the first time. It's a pretty neat network of piping, and it's all that's right buried under the farm. See how it holds up.
Did you want to say anything else?
I was just gonna say FSA has been working closely with NC Department of Ag to try and find these funding gaps and then figure out how we can cover that moving forward. We ended up doing joint agency estimates, and we included all the culverts, all the gravel. Just kind of a wild rough estimate of how many farms were affected in Watauga and Avery counties and what that cost per pipe by size and the amount of gravel to put that in would be. And topsoil also, we're trying to get that covered.
Mhm.
So I would hang on to receipts even for that stuff. So hopefully they will find funding and cover that.
Mhm.
So, basically, I'm just trying to offset the cost of all that pipe.
Yeah.
And it's not a tremendous amount of money, but
Well, yeah, I know you've been working with the excavator and
yeah, it's
so,
a tractor and the hours.
yeah, so we can put in again, shaping, grading and do some practices for that.
So the key thing to keep in mind, I've heard like communication come up. We'll close on this. Kind of the level of overwhelm at the agency knows the level of overwhelm on the producer. So each time, like when you leave Sarah's office, I want you to leave. And if you have to ask her a second time, if you have to ask her to handwrite a list, do that, but leave with a very clear idea of exactly what you would be paid for. She might not have the calculation of the payment yet, but know what you've applied for and where it's gonna apply on your farm. And then every time you have completed something, or in your case, if you've already completed a section of work, report that back to her. Okay,
Again, that was something else I wanted to clarify a little bit. we can do partial payments.
Okay.
It doesn't have to just be, it's not just the full practice has to be complete and then you get a partial payment. If you make a unit complete, if you have finished all the fencing around the field so that it's usable, workable again, we can draw in that length and extent and give you a partial payment on that piece. Even for like the grading, leveling, if you've made it reusable back to the condition it was in, we can do partial payments as you work.
So I'll say one thing to that and then answer your question. So if communication is always kind of like the thing that gets you and feels tough and you hate it, then know that that's gonna be what's more difficult for you. It's like every time you complete something and you want a partial payment and it's like, you gotta show your documentation that you finished it, right? There's gonna be this correspondence back and forth. If that's a headache for you, just like anticipate that that's what that is. Or you can wait until you're absolutely all complete and probably get one lump payment, but that's gonna be much further along. So try to kind of match what's like your head capacity with what your financial need is.
I just wanted to say that Frontline Farm is gonna start working with rich women in agriculture. So I'm not a farmer, I'm a communication person, so I really appreciate your knowledge on communication. And what we're trying to do is fundraise for money that we can then push out to farmers directly. And so if you're interested in getting on the list of farm needs, then please go to the Frontline Farm website and email me so that I can work with Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture and try to get you something. And maybe some of what I'm looking for now is wish lists. And if you could put in how much money things cost, that would help you forever, because that's killing me trying to look that stuff up. But even if it's something small, if we can match a donor who has some, maybe culvert stuff or something, and we can get that to you, then that's what we're gonna try to do.
And we'll talk to each of you about RAFI's like state of financial assistance too, because we're just doing it on a case by case basis. So how we can complement. But as we've talked about, just keep in mind, all of these payments, USDA or private, are taxable income. Okay. If anyone wants to stay longer and chat about any particular topic, whether it's policy with Rachel or application assistance with Liz or I, we weren't gonna commit Sarah to staying on the clock because this was an event we put together. But you're welcome to if you want. And then any other resource providers, if you want to touch base with folks.
So
We're not gonna like close out the space yet.
I'll just touch on your last comment about taxable income.
Mhm.
So, I don't, most people have accountants, but some people don't. You've got to be able to expense every single penny that you get in funding. And if you're not expensing it, then you will pay taxes on it. So, yes, it's taxable income, but if you can show an expense against it for your accounting, then you can avoid taxation.
Mhm.
But if you're not, like, if you're only spending a third of it on the intended purpose, then you're gonna pay taxes on that because you don't have any expense out to that.
Good advice. Well, thank you all. We appreciate you coming in the snow. And we'll just make sure that anything we said we'd follow up with you about, that we close up with that. And if you want to just sit down and talk through more about your scenarios now, we're here to do that too. So, appreciate y'all.